guys, what's going on? This is Roth and Eric here to talk about the big finale episode of Game of Thrones Season 5. So, if you haven't watched it yet, get out of here. Go watch it. Come back. Then chat with us. Let us know what you thought. So, you ready? Full spoilers ahead. Eric, what'd you think?
I liked it. I didn't love it. We were coming off two kind of terrific episodes, I thought, and really, that this has been an interesting season and that it kind of like the first half, people were like, oh, it's kind of slow moving, and then I thought, really, those last few, huge momentum. The finale was good, and there were some great moments in it, certainly. There was also some stuff I thought was a little rushed, or maybe didn't have the build-up that, to have the full impact on a show that's known for very impactful moments. There were some things where I thought, oh, you could have built that up better. That could have meant more. They were, it's Game of Thrones. There's a million characters, so of course they have to rush around, and some people only get a scene or two. But there was some time. I almost wished it was like a double-length episode at times.
And it's interesting because I don't know that would have solved what some of the issues were with it. And this is what I mean. There were some stories that we didn't want to spend much more time with, And I think that maybe what feels like some of the uneven moments of the finale reflect the season as a whole.
Right.
And in that way, it's a very accurate finale. I also feel like it did have amazing moments in it, and I do think that that's something I've seen the response on the internets, and it's been shockingly to me, overwhelmingly negative. Not in the sense that people are like, oh, I was a little disappointed that felt uneven, but like, this piece of I'm not allowed to curse show, where I'm like, let's maybe pull that back a little bit. I don't think that it's quite gone to the level of this show is no longer any good. I'm done. Do you?
No. I've seen some of that, but it's like a couple things that I think are at work here. One is that because there's this onus on even a season finale, much less a series finale, but a season finale to really deliver. So when we're on a show like Game of Thrones that in general people love, and it's coming off of a few weeks of people being like, this is awesome episodes. When you have a finale that's just good, there's going to be that disappointment, which will then be reflected in it sucked. There's also the fact that let's talk about the big thing, which is that when you end with killing Jon Snow, who is like one of the last sort of paragons of virtue and a hero figure. Yeah, it's another moment for a show that's had about a half dozen of these now of I'm out.
Yeah,
there are people who are like, that's it, you've gone too far. I'm out, even though most of those people are not out. Yeah. But we are in that moment, right? Yeah. And so that's where I think some of those two elements, I think, add to sort of a fury that's not really real, because there's still such strong moments. And I think you look at the episode and it's a good episode of Game of Thrones, but there are people who wanted more and who right now are really upset because Game of Thrones is an upsetting show often.
Yeah, it is an upsetting show. Yeah. And it has been more and more, I feel, divisive as it's gone on, which is sort of interesting and something that we can delve into at some point. But in general, I think that inherently, and we've talked about this before, inherently an issue that the showrunners have had to solve. And sort of everybody's like blaming the showrunners entirely for any kind of uneven or clunkiness that has happened throughout this season. I loved many moments of this finale, by the way, so I'm not meaning to sound negative, and we'll talk about those. But is that the books introduce more and more characters, more and more complex story threads, some of which have resolution, some of which do not.
Yeah.
And I think that they're doing the best that they can to manage that. Having said that, I don't think they have done an exemplary job, say, with Dorne, right? That's a storyline that we all sort of felt very meh about this season, and just were like, okay. You almost wish it wasn't there. You just wish, but ostensibly speaking, we imagine that if it is there, there's a reason, and because that's going to play out in a bigger way going forward, right? I also think that inherently problematic is that first big death, Ned, shocking, right?
Right.
Like just devastating to the viewer. And then you got the Red Wedding, devastating, right? And then at a certain point, people start to feel really apathetic. And they're like, okay, I get it. All the Starks, it's going to suck for them, they're going to die, and everybody evil is going to win.
Someone named Stark wronged George R. R. Martin as a kid.
Like, they're just going to die, and that's going to suck. And I sort of get that point of view, but at the same time, this is the source material.
Yeah.
This is the story.
Yeah, well, we have now pretty caught up in most respects. We have caught up to the books now, which makes next season extremely interesting, unless he gets that book out in front, which he won't. Yeah, it's right now the big things, most of the big things that, like we were saying, like, how could you kill Jon Snow off like that? Well, that's in the books,
Yeah.
It's like these are moments that are taken from the books, and that is the story. And of course, the books have even more time maybe to delve into things and get even more psychological. But still, yeah, it is intrinsically not just a dark story, but often a depressing story, and often one that feels nihilistic, because it's like right until we know the ending, it's like, oh, is it just about good people dying,
and losing, and bad people sort of being rewarded for their bad behavior. Hey, guess what? We see a lot of that in the world, sadly. Not always, but okay, so my overall thoughts about this episode is that thematically, which is, I want to commend the showrunners for having been able to create thematic links this season to stories that don't inherently necessarily have them. And the big one for me last night was once again, just what's the cost of vengeance? We saw that with Brienne.
Yeah.
She sort of gave up her opportunity to save Sansa and fulfill her vow. To Catelyn by going for revenge. We saw that with certainly Cersei, like she tried to get revenge on Marjorie for slighting her and embarrassing her. Well, now you're really embarrassed and humiliated. You know what that feels like. Arya being sort of blinded because she went for vengeance versus duty. And certainly in Dorne, that was about revenge, though. Again, we'll talk about how that sort of played out. Those are our general thoughts. We want to know what you think. Leave your comments below. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Do you have big questions about the show going forward? We're going to dig in much deeper now for our larger show. So if you want to see that, well, you should definitely click on it when it's available.
Or you're just watching it happen right now.
Or you're watching it happen right now. Here we go. Okay. So let's talk about that idea. Let's talk about the decisions that people made, which, by the way, I think is a very human choice to be like, well, you could do the right thing right now for the greater good, or you could satisfy your thirst for vengeance. What did you make of each individual's decision to, like Arya? That was probably the most satisfying scene of the night, right?
Right. How can anyone not want her to do that, especially on this show, because we so rarely get the clear, like, I will avenge this.
Yes.
And because, you go way far back to, like, Ned's killed, and as shocking as that was, people were like, well, now Rob will avenge him.
Yes.
No, he won't. Yeah, so because this is a show that always undercuts that, when Arya gets to actually just decimate this guy who in season 1, 5 years ago, did one terrible thing in a list of many that has affected Arya, it's incredibly satisfying, right? And it's hard not to, just because the show so rarely gives us that, how can you not sort of side with her wanting to do that?
And let's face it, this guy was already a heel, a horrible person that we won't spend the time doing it now, but you can go look at the list of things he has done.
What an interesting, creepy reflection of the fact that Joffrey had him beat Sansa, and it turns out he's just a sadist because, he likes young girls, and he might like to do other stuff to them too, but he also definitely likes just beating the hell out of them because he's sick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that they just for the TV viewer who understandably some of this stuff gets really confused, like, who is this person again? What did they do? He's like, I think they're like, even if you don't remember that, we're going to have him beat these little girls.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're really going to be on board with Arya making this choice. It's going to feel great to watch her stab him, and brutal, man. It was awesomely brutal. What a great scene.
Oh, yeah, there was eye gouging, there was all sorts of
But just sort of highlighting how, and this is, I think, one of the things that is inherently difficult about this series, how confusing it can be, is not only did a lot of people, I think, not remember who he was, but, so she told him, do you remember me? I remember you. You did this. But I was with a group of people that didn't remember that Arya could have put on a face.
Right.
Because when they saw that girl look up, they were like, oh, I thought it would be Arya.
Yeah.
Maybe it's this other girl, which is why I think they had her remove the face.
Oh, completely, yeah.
But I do think that is a confusing lesson. A confusing element of that potentially.
I think it's just, it kind of, unfortunately, it just goes with the territory, though, again, because it is a show that's so dense, with so many characters. There's been pretty funny articles people have done about, like, showing your parents Game of Thrones characters, like, what are they named, and trying to remember that stuff. So yeah, that's one reason they've cut out a lot of characters from the books, because this is already a show with them. I don't always remember, I had to be reminded, like, when Meryn Trant came back. I'm like, wait, who is that guy again? I know he's someone bad, you know? And when they show previous Leons that include, which this episode had 2 of from 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, yeah.
Benjamin Stark, right?
Right. And when Meryn killed Syrio, you know,
Yeah.
this is ancient history on a show that is never just like, you know, I guess there's 1 or 2 exceptions when they've had, you know, a storyline focus on, an episode focused on one storyline, but usually is like so many places at once. So yeah, that can get really tricky. I think though they had enough with Arya this season and with the masks and all that even if you forgot that, I think most people would be like, okay. I mean, then they literally had her go back and put the mask onto the thing. So it should at that point.
At that point, it connects.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting because again, I think that each of these people that chose the path of vengeance, like one of the things that the series is about is like everything has a cost.
Yeah.
That was most directly illustrated with Arya in terms of she stabbed him in the eyes. It's a little different than the books, but she stabbed him in the eyes. Now she's gone blind, sort of as a punishment. But almost a worse punishment, I mean, not a worse punishment, but I think a heartbreaking element, and this is something Matt brought up in his review, is the realization that this man who she was like, this is my friend, this is the only touchstone I have, someone I recognize in the world that connects me and grounds me, isn't possibly real. This is just another face.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's no one.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I mean, we'll talk more about the finale in terms of some of the things I don't think worked on it, or sometimes I think we're a little simplistic, which is on a show that, it is easy to joke about, like, oh, that's the show where awful things happen to people, often people you like. So, yeah, it was kind of sad, and also there was a frustrating element to the fact that we did get such a crowd-pleasing revenge, and then instantly something terrible happens to her. Terrible in a way that's sort of mystical and can be undone, but still it's like, you know, this is Game of Thrones, so no one can relish in victory, you know. She goes back and instantly someone dies who she thinks is someone close to her, but even if it's not, it's someone has taken his own life because of what she did, and now she's blind.
And now she's blind, and it's a horrible thing, but I think fundamentally, like, that can be, well, the death can't be undone, but her blindness can potentially be undone, but also, that feeling of stark aloneness, I think that's almost the worst part. She's just so alone. And she's such a little girl. I mean, on the show, she's a teenager, but she's like a little girl in this book series. But even as a teenager, she's just so profoundly alone. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that is really difficult for her. Now, so these are my 2 favorite scenes of the night, which were Arya, which I think most people would probably be on board with, as loving that moment of her executing him. But the Walk of Shame, I thought was beautifully executed, and I think highlights what this series does so well, is that takes a repugnant character that we universally hate and want to see shamed and humiliated, and I think executed that scene, and a lot of credit is due to Lena Headey and her performance. That we're able to empathize with her, and I think it had to be that long in order for me to really go, good. Oh God. Oh, the humanity. Stop it.
No, I agree. You had to feel it with her, you know, while not literally quite in real time, because real time would probably take 45 minutes. You know. Still, you had to feel the weight of this, and that this was no small thing, and that she had to basically cross the city.
Yeah.
And it got worse and worse, you know, because at first no one's saying anything really, and then once they start screaming at her and throwing things,
it's a pile-on, and that's what happens with mob mentality.
And that she at first is able to keep her fierceness initially, that strength that she does have, no matter what you think of her, she's a strong character, and then she can't, you know, at a certain point, she is human, she's a bad person in a lot of ways, but she is human.
We've never seen her be vulnerable in this way. We've seen her be fearful for her children, but we have never seen her break like this.
And I think it was important because in the books, you know, I will say at this point in the books, while she is in no way, she's not being redeemed like Jaime. Jaime is on a redemption arc, right? Cersei is not on a redemption arc. She's still doing awful things. But we do get inside her mind a little more, and we kind of understand a little bit more of what shaped her, and being a woman in this world who could never be actually given a open position of power. What's forged her. But that being said, on the show where we haven't gotten all that and she's pretty hateable, yeah, by the end of that scene, I think if nothing else, it's powerful if by the end of the scene you can't cheer, right?
Yeah, no.
Can't, maybe if you begin the scene, you're like, she's getting hers.
Yeah.
By the end of it, most people, I don't think, would be like,
I think it's interesting because
you can't keep cheering.
I was talking to, actually, I just want to bring up a couple of social questions related to this topic. Rashad H. just says, please do discuss that phenomenal performance during the longest walk of shame ever from Lena Headey. I can't say enough about what a tremendous actress she is because she has from the start been able to take this character and make her more interesting and more dimensional than she was on the page.
Yeah.
Which is saying a lot. It is really hard to do that, you know?
And, let's acknowledge so people don't think we don't know. We know they used the body double.
Yes.
But obviously it was still like her face, her performance.
It was her face, yeah, exactly.
And yeah, because there's literally no dialogue for the brunt of it. And so she is just showing us this journey, like I said, from her character going from like, I will get through this to barely keeping it together to the moment at the end where the mountain shows up and there's that glint of, now I have an opening now for revenge, that like getting herself back a little bit there.
I really want to talk about Frank and Mountain. But first I just want to, we sort of already talked about this, but Sean asks, if she suffered enough for us now to root for her like we did for Jamie. No, I don't think so. I really don't think that she's going to become a beloved character the way that Jamie did. But the fact that we could feel for her at all is what's phenomenal.
Yeah, she hasn't made, because we've seen her suffer maybe more than she needed to, but what Jamie was making a decision when he chose to help Brienne, it was about this guy making a choice to do something he didn't need to do.
Yeah.
So that is different as far as like rooting for him more actively.
I don't think you root for someone just because they're suffering. I think you root for them when they make the decision to rise to the occasion and despite the challenges be a better person. Right. That's when you really root for someone. But it's interesting because I did talk to a couple of people. The group that I was in, a couple of people felt more kind of pain watching that scene than even the end scene with Jon Snow. But I did talk to a couple of people, including my brother, who were like, I didn't have any sympathy for her. And he was like, you know what I thought? And this I thought was an interesting take, so I want to ask you what you think about it. He's like, I feel like it's such a bougie response to be like, oh, poor Cersei walking around naked, doing this walk of shame. He's like, half of the characters would have loved that punishment versus what they got. Right. And I said, yeah, well, certainly Theon would. Way have taken that. So do you think that it is sort of like it's not that bad, come on, kind of bougie response to feel like this is a very terrible thing?
I mean, in the world of Game of Thrones, we know it can get worse than that. Sure, yeah. My wife was kind of similar, probably to your brother, in that my wife actively said, well, she's getting what she deserved. Yet, my wife was not cheering it on like she was cheering Arya killing that guy. It is that thing of like, you can still be like, she's reaping what she sowed, and yet still feel like the humanity of the situation, and it is almost a victory just to get you not to cheer for that happening to her by the end,
So let's talk a little bit about one of the other people that chose vengeance, which was Brienne. Now, it was, as many people have pointed out, a pretty quintessentially like movie trick moment to be like, the minute she turns her back, the light goes on. And I agree. And I also sort of, part of me was like, what, you couldn't have Pod like keep watch while you went and took care of Stannis? Like Pod wasn't even with her when she was taking care of Stannis. So like, why couldn't Pod watch for the candle while she did this? Just take a minute is what I'm saying, is to get organized and plan your revenge before you go to execute it. But what did you think of that choice that she chose vengeance over her vow to Catelyn? Yeah,
it is interesting because it goes back to, when we first met her, she was at Renly's side. We learned more this season about what Renly meant to her as a person and why she, she was in essence in love with him, but no matter what, she was indebted to him, someone who had shown her kindness in a time in her life when no one would.
She basically did the "my name is Inigo Montoya" speech, right? You killed my Renly, prepare to die.
But as someone who is sort of an honorable character, very honor bound, and was very determined to keep her promise to Cat, there is that part of you that's like, oh, but especially it was weird because here's where you kind of have to somewhat give the show some rope, but at the same time, because look, so they cut over the main battle, which of course is another budgetary decision. They literally have to choose their battles on this show, right?
Literally, yeah.
And they just gave us an amazing one a couple weeks back, right, with the White Walkers, which was a CGI filled one.
To me, that didn't bother me so much, because to me it was like once you saw the horses literally being able to surround them, you're like, well, they're done.
Right. I was fine with that too.
Fighting back.
More, I was talking about what you were saying, which is like, because Pod wasn't even with her, there was a lot of like, well, what exactly? She obviously kind of sat out that battle, so there was that question of like, what was she doing during all that time?
Hanging behind the trees, keeping an eye on Stannis.
Like, ooh, you know,
so damn.
It was kind of a little bit of like, I wish there was a little more sort of connective tissue there. And then, of course, by the way, though, on a show that is so unequivocal and merciless with death, when you cut away from someone who is about to die, that's a huge question mark.
Which brings me to another social question. I know you're shocked, but this is, where is it? I mean, I want to get the person's name, but it's obvious that question is going to be obvious, which is Stannis really dead?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't find your name. Forgive me, but probably not.
Probably not.
Because they have no problem with brutality, and they have no problem with showing it. So I'm like, no, Stannis is probably not dead.
And I kind of hope he's not, because this was an element where if he is dead, I did feel again that the finale was kind of rushed in some ways.
Yeah.
So Stannis, we just left off on him making this horrific decision, right, that turned everyone rightfully against him. Both in real life, but then it turns out on the show he lost like half his followers, and it was the he'd sacrificed everything, and then what it had wrought thing. Yet I still felt like we've seen him go through so much that if he was just in kind of those couple of scenes, wasn't enough. Like I felt like there's more to his story to be told, and maybe his story will be about losing everything after sacrificing like things that were so personal to him. Sacrificed his child, his wife killed herself as a result, and yet it was still in service of, well, I will get the crown, which is what I think is my destiny and all this. So to follow him next season, I hope they do, because I feel like it was kind of rushed if that was it for him.
I agree, and my hope too is that, Stannis living with the devastation, and I hope that this is actually the decision that Brienne kind of makes, which is that it's going to be harder for you to live with this than it is for you to die right now.
Yeah.
She doesn't know everything that's going into it, but she knows that he's an ambitious man and he just lost.
Yeah.
Was devastated, lost everything. But yeah, it's going to be harder for Stannis to live with having done what he did for nothing. That's A. And then two, I think if you remove I think a lot of people are jumping to the conclusion that Melisandre was playing him.
Right.
I don't think so. I think she really, truly believed what she was doing, as fanatics do. And so whether
she looked sad too.
She looked devastated.
To see that what was actually happening. It's not what she thought was going to happen.
Because it's not what she thought was going to happen. And I do think that she believed in the cause. And here's the thing about Game of Thrones. Let's pretend, we talked about this the other week, let's pretend she is getting visions. And let's pretend that those divisions are supernaturally, I don't know, delivered? That's who sent the letter. She's still a human being that's interpreting them, right?
Right.
She could have misinterpreted, A, or whatever the supernatural entity is could have a plan that she only knows this much of.
Yeah.
And maybe part of that plan was, we need to get Stannis out of the way.
Right.
I'm going to tell you it's this other thing.
Right.
But that's what I really want.
Yeah,
you know?
I think there's just a lot of room there with Stannis, because especially on a show where we've got characters like Ramsay and people who sort of relish in the horribleness they do, because he didn't relish in it. He loved his daughter.
Yeah.
Yet, we can't understand that he, it's hard to get ourselves in the mind frame of him loving his daughter and yet sacrificing her, but that's what makes him an interesting character to follow if he did all that for nothing,
What does he do at that point?
Right.
How does he reconcile that? Is it possible? Probably not, I would assume. Yeah, this brings us to another question, which is, and this will lead us to something else. Coach Marcus says, who's Melisandre going to follow next? Well, this is going to bring us to a bigger topic.
Yes.
Which is, ostensibly speaking, she went back to the Wall potentially for safety. But also possibly because she's like maybe going to follow Jon Snow or something to that effect, or believe that that person is someone that she needs to invest some time and energy in, which leads us to another big question. Is Jon Snow dead? Which is a question people have. Now, he got stabbed 6 times pretty brutally.
Yes, he did.
And if he is dead, will he be reanimated? Because, and this is not a book spoiler. If you remember from the show, she can do that.
Yeah, we'll just say unequivocally, we've caught up to the books in almost every big respect. The books left off where the show left off. So we do not know
if he's dead or not.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah. But
George,
just remember, the show has introduced Beric back in season 3, who was a follower of the Lord of Light, who kept being resurrected. So that idea is already out there in the world. It is a part of this TV show we're watching. Ripe for a previously on from several years ago to remind us of this. And in fact, and Beric met Melisandre, who was very, remember she was surprised to that he'd been resurrected that many times, but not that he'd been resurrected at all. So the timing of that, of her returning to the castle right before Jon is killed. My answer, I think Jon is dead, but I also think he might not be staying dead.
Yeah, I think he might not be staying dead. And remember, she was sidling up to him some while she was there at Castle Black, being like, oh, hey, you and me, we can make a smoke, baby. Which, she's not going to do that with just anyone. Somebody that she thinks is powerful, that she thinks has a role to play, so she will, or she wants something out of it. But I do think that there's a couple more possibilities in the book that we can talk about later for Jon. But that's definitely one that absolutely exists in the show, that he is dead, because you don't get stabbed that many times and not survive. I mean, and not die. In that world, you know what I mean? It's not like they can rush him to the ER and surgery. But Melisandre is there, and she could resurrect him. So a question somebody had about that. I will say this too. I'll just point out in this moment that sort of one of the uneven qualities of the show for me, and I have really still enjoyed the show, by the way, this is not me disliking it, is certain things are telegraphed. I feel like Ollie's role in Jon's death was very telegraphed.
Yeah, and now for those of you who don't watch the book spoiler part, we talked about this. It seemed Ollie's not a character from the books. So what happened in the show is the same thing that happened in the books, except that Ollie was kind of presented there way more, I think, to set up a personal stakes character, almost to a fault in an extent, because it's like, what is this character doing here this season? Everything is about him being like, you're trusting wildlings? You shouldn't trust wildlings. I don't like that you're doing this, and they killed my family.
They killed my parents, again, prepare to die. Which seems to be the message that people are getting.
I do want to... Oh, sorry. What were you saying?
Oh, no. I mean, he was out for... That's the third... That's another revenge tale, Ollie.
An understandable one.
And why they killed him and how they killed him in the books is a little different, slightly different, the motivations. But it's ultimately like, we don't think you're doing the right thing for the Night's Watch, except for Ollie, who's straight up like, I'm going to revenge murder you.
And I will say, in the show, just the show... I don't know if that was properly motivated, that everyone else... Ollie was the one who was... And that's why we even debated whether Ollie would do it by himself or not. Because I do think on the show, they didn't give us quite enough. Yes, they were like, hey, we don't trust the wildlings. They've been our enemies. We just fought them. Then he brings them last week. They arrive, and we have that scene with Alistair Throne being like, you're very noble. That's going to get you killed. Which could be like, wink, wink, I'm going to help kill you. But... the way Throne had even been presented...
No, he said that's going to get us all killed.
Get us all killed, yeah. But it still felt like we needed a few more scenes, because the wildlings had arrived, and then what? You know, how were they coexisting? Let's also not forget that there were a few other Night's Watch who survived and made it back with Jon, who could back up the story now and be like, yeah, we freaking need some help. This is very, very serious. So to not have any of that presented and to just leap to like a bunch of the Night's Watch killing Jon, I felt like we were jumping over a few things there.
I did and I didn't. I think that they, again, the thing with Ollie is good and it's bad because they telegraphed it pretty hardcore, but it's also justified. You get why the kid is doing it.
He had motivation, right?
And Alistair hates him. He has always hated Jon Snow. He wants to be commander of the Night's Watch, and this was his opportunity. It's just him being motivated by desire for power and hatred would not surprise me. The rest of them, a little bit like et tu Brute, that moment. And the moment doesn't have, it's not as profound as if they still loved him but felt like he was failing them as a leader. That's a better, more impactful story. But I think for the sake of time, that's not where the showrunners took it, which is almost too bad because it's way more emotionally impactful.
Yeah.
To have people that don't want to do this.
Yeah, who are
crying.
upset doing it.
Who are upset doing it, but must, or feel they must. Which is way more of the Caesar story. Brute loves Caesar, but Caesar no good. So yeah, I mean, having said that, it was still an impactful scene because we love Jon Snow.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Oh, definitely. And I will say this, though, with both the book and the show, and yes, I know Kit Harington and the showrunners did an interviews where they basically were all saying, yeah, he's dead, he's off the show, Kit Harington's I'm off the show. And yet, on a show and a book series that has been so merciless in taking out characters you think are main characters and heroes, it feels like it would be a misstep to take out Jon Snow completely from the story. It seems like other major deaths still helped motivate other characters.
Right.
You could see how it would spin off big events. There's a lot that Jon, sort of resting on Jon's shoulders, and he's kind of carrying a lot of that story, even in a way that Sam can't.
Yeah.
And so I just don't feel Jon's story is done.
And I don't feel the Night's Watch story can be done.
No, no.
You know?
It can't be. I mean, unless it's just like, oh yeah, they all got killed by the White Walkers that Jon would have helped.
And here they come into the rest of the realm. Doesn't that suck?
So it just doesn't feel like we're his like
Although
killing.
I guess it could be that.
It could be that. But it just, and if you look at the entirety of the series, it feels like there's more to tell with Jon Snow, one way or the other.
Yeah. Let's talk about a death that definitely happened and did not feel quite as impactful as it may have otherwise, which is, as predicted, that let's remember the prophecy that Cersei faced in the beginning of the season, that gold would be their crown and their shroud. They're going to die. Basically, it's their hair and their crown, and now they're going to die. So her daughter, Myrcella, who I don't think we had enough time with to invest in enough to feel that, A. Two, the Dorne storyline was just so uneven. They sort of, again, telegraphed it, I guess, seeded it with the poison and the antidote, and I guess you have to, that Bronn was poisoned and he got the antidote. And honestly, when that moment happened, I was like, why is she saving his life?
Right.
That whole dynamic just didn't work of like, oh, they like each other.
Right.
I don't think that really worked. And then, look, that would have been a very touching moment between Jaime and his daughter, done earlier, done in another way.
If we cared about her, honestly, I didn't dislike her. I had no feelings for her.
Right.
You know, she was kind of a blank slate. She was a young teenage girl in love with this boy, and that's about it. It was very surface level, and I gotta say that scene played almost like self-parody to me, because it was almost like the SNL skit of like if you're doing about Game of Thrones being a show where tragic things happen, because in one scene they had to have him admitting he was her dad, her saying I kind of knew, her saying I love you, I accept you, you're my father, and then she dies.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like it was so rushed to have all that happen in one scene and to try to make us feel that much in one scene. That just didn't work for me at all.
And I also, there was a moment like once they started to get snuggly with each other, I was like, unleash the Kraken. Like obviously something's about to happen. And to be honest, the minute she kissed her lips, I was like, well, that's the kiss of death and it's poison and she's going to die. I mean, that's a couple of things that I think were problematic in terms of yielding a very emotionally impactful scene, but it's also like, and our colleague pointed out, the boat is 300 yards away.
They're looking at it.
They're looking at it like, turn back and kill them, you know?
Right.
Like, it's certainly, I think that what they were trying to link here thematically is that her thirst for vengeance is going to mean war for all of her people.
Yeah.
You know, they just blew any diplomacy, and now here comes a war, and it's just another sort of, this is why we can't have nice things, because human nature sucks, and people will inevitably go for the, not always, but I think a lot of times we'll go for the baser drive.
Yeah.
And I do think that the baser drive is vengeance, and the higher good is the the more intellectually, rationally motivated thing to do.
Yeah.
And none of them chose that. You know, all of them were like, I'm gonna get mine.
Right. This is personal.
This is personal, just like Jaws 3. But this one just didn't play as well. And I think it was one of the things that made the finale sort of uneven. I've always liked Game of Thrones episodes that were focused on one or two characters a little more. How about you?
Oh yeah, often that, or even what they did with Hardhome, which is by sticking with Jon for pretty much the last 20, 25 minutes.
Right.
It jumped around a lot in the first half of that episode, but then they're like, okay, this is important.
Yeah.
We're just going to stay here, you know? And like, we're going to talk next week, we're going to do a wrap up on the season, and I think we'll talk more about sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the season overall. But I will say, just with the Jaime thing, because I do love Jaime as a character and he's been a fascinating character to chart, it made me sad that I didn't feel more sad for Jaime in that scene, right? Because that should have been like a huge, for us watching, emotional moment of like, oh man, like Jaime's losing his daughter in his arms. But because it had kind of been mishandled, the lead up to it, and that scene kind of having us try to have so much happen in one scene, it didn't hit home like so many other losses have.
So I'm going to pose this question to all of us. Normally, I think in an episode where seemingly, you know, several characters died and we lost several characters, I would say, what is the most important or most impactful death for you in this episode? I think we know the answer, but I'm actually going to say, what is the most impactful moment for you? Because I think that we have some candidates. I think that the moments are either Arya getting her revenge and killing. So, you know, like, you were the first one on my list, and I'm going to get you so brutally. That moment, Arya, the punishment for that, losing her sight and losing her only connection to have feeling that she has a real friend in the world. Stannis's death, but maybe he's not really dead because we cut away, so maybe Brienne didn't do it. John's probably he's really dead, whether he's coming back or not. Or what else? Oh, the Walk of Shame.
Yeah. To me, I mean, it's to me the easy two, and I know I'm cheating by even saying two though.
You are cheating. You have to pick one. You can pick two.
Is the Arya killing him and the Cersei Walk of Shame, because they're very different emotions, right?
Forgive me for interrupting you because I want to hear what you have to say. But I literally forgot this one, which is Myrcella, which tells you where it lands on
We
the
also
list.
haven't talked about, we'll talk in a minute, about Sansa and Theon, by the way.
Oh my God. Okay, so Sansa and Theon is in this list. You know, I'm going to start the list again. So let's talk about the most impactful moment of the night.
We don't need to name them all again.
We don't need to name them all again, but which one is it?
It's a tie to me for Arya, because on a visceral level, it's Arya killing him, and it's also one of the few times you can just cheer, you know. But emotionally it was, and that's saying something again, because she's a villain on the show. It was Cersei, and because we're kind of in her headspace, you know, and it is a long sequence and kind of putting you through that experience, which is wrenching, but very well done. You know, kudos to the show for pulling that off and putting you inside her to the fact that you would feel, oh, this is awful, whether you like her or not, and most people don't like her because of what the experience is. So that's why I say those two scenes, because they are very different in what they are trying to, and I think succeeded in accomplishing with the audience.
The thing for me is that we've already talked about why Myrcella didn't work, because that storyline sort of didn't work. We weren't attached to her. Theon and Sansa, which we haven't talked about yet, I thought was a good moment, but didn't quite have the emotional punch that the Walk of Shame did, or viscerally, Arya's killing. Stannis, I don't think he really is dead. The one that shocks me is, because they cut away, is Jon, which I felt, you know, I really felt that loss, but I'm wondering why that didn't land as much as that, emotionally, impactfully, as much as that walk, and as much as Arya seeking her revenge. Why do you think?
I don't know. Let's.
Is it because people are sort of worn down by the number of shocking deaths on the show, or are there just one too many shocking deaths?
I don't know if there's one too many, but it certainly does speak to the fact that there's been so many shocking deaths that maybe it does sometimes take a other shocking thing to happen, and someone being put through a different horrible circumstance, you know, that is going to jar you now in a way that someone being stabbed many times, even if it's someone you love, that maybe it does take something else at this point.
It's interesting because I think that, people have maybe in a way started to become apathetic to it, which is a sad result of this series. But what do you guys think? Was it Jon? Was that the moment that you felt most profoundly?
I mean, there were people on Twitter who, again, that was a I'm out, even if they're not really out moment because they were so upset that Jon was killed. So I think there are some people who think that.
So, well, let me ask you this. In general, is one of the issues that the show is going to have to overcome at this point the fact that people have become desensitized and feel like they're being gimmicky? Again, this is part of the source material, gimmicky with the number of deaths of the Starks, and maybe this is just now unrealistic.
Yeah, I think we are at a tipping point for that. We are at a tipping point maybe for, it's a weird combination of factors. We talked a week or two ago about the whole, is it too depressing, where some people think it is, and some, can it almost be self-parody, and when it's handled poorly, like it was with the Jamie Marcella thing. But I actually am kind of optimistic going forward to the fact that, again, I do think Benioff and Weiss are now aiming towards the end.
Yes.
More than George R. R. Martin
More
is.
than George R. R. Martin is.
And so I do think they're looking at the next 2 years, maybe 3, and that's a huge decision HBO and them have to come to soon. But I think they are aiming more than ever. Like we said, they raced through 2 huge books in one season. Yeah. And I think that
cherry picking the most significant moments.
Even though we've heard they'll probably use some of that they skip might come next year, but in the biggest sense, they raced through 2 books in one season. I think they're aiming towards the end now, and I think that might change things as far as, of course, there are going to be more deaths. Obviously, there'll be more deaths, but maybe it won't be so much about that as much as now we're aiming towards, everything coming together, literally the characters coming together and seeing an end game more than we ever have.
So I agree with you that I think that it does become problematic for a television viewer because of anticipation.
Yeah.
You anticipate these things happening to some degree, and then you feel like they're just trying to play with my emotions. They're just it feels manipulative at a certain point, though I don't think it is. And I'm going to say this very quickly, bringing up a real life kind of event very quickly, just to highlight. A few years ago, I went to a very war-torn area to do a documentary, and I interviewed one woman who had lost 4 sons in the span of 5 years. And it was one of them was shot and killed while the other one was in surgery. Because to me, it's not unrealistic what happens in this show, in the sense that they are in a time of war.
Sure.
And many people are going to be killed. And it's multiple wars on multiple fronts, and it's going to be very brutal. I think that from the perspective of the world that we live in, fortunately, here in the US and sort of in most of Europe, and well, not all of Europe actually, anyway, but from sort of that perspective, that kind of insulated, isolated perspective, that seems unrealistic, but it's actually not for war.
Sure.
That's my take on it.
But you're making a TV show.
And
it's
making a
5
TV
years
you're
in,
making a TV show.
5 years into a TV show, so at a certain point you have to ask, what are people coming back to watch each week, and what are their hopes in the long term? And if you do keep hitting the same beat too many times at a certain point,
people feel disengaged.
Yeah, and I do understand it, because there's always going to be people going, what show do you think you signed up for?
Yeah.
Valid, but at the same time, there is a part where you're like, I've seen this before. I've seen this.
It just feels tricky, and you get apathetic towards
it.
So I agree. We don't know where it's going next as book readers, but they're going to have to find a solution. I know we've got to wrap up really soon. Theon and Sansa.
Yeah. Again, it was weird because it was another time where I wished we had a scene or two more. It was difficult because of course, we talked a lot about, because Sansa had been put in such a horrific, victimized place, we really wanted her in one way or the other to find her own inner strength, and she did do a respect. I mean, I don't want to. It's not nothing that she got out of her cell and went and lit that candle, and it would be maybe too simple for her to just kill Ramsay. I just wish there was a little more, and with Theon too, honestly, because Theon had been so much about how beaten down he was, to the point that when he had a moment where Sansa was giving him a moment to do something heroic and not for himself, he couldn't. So that being the case, I almost felt like Theon needed a scene or two more, to show what would make him finally make his Darth Vader looking back and forth between the
Yeah.
Emperor and Luke
Yeah.
moment,
Push
and push her and stop her and kill her like that. So
That was a satisfying death.
it was satisfying for sure, especially since Ramsay's still out there.
Yeah.
Well, at least his sick girlfriend is
Yeah,
gone.
at least she's out of the picture.
Yeah, and then we see Sansa and Theon make that sort of leap, which was a nice moment as far as like maybe they're leaping to their. I don't think they're leaping to their death, but at this
I'd
point,
rather die.
they'd rather die. They'd both
Yeah.
rather die. They have both suffered such atrocities at the hands
Yeah.
of the same guy.
Yeah.
That they would rather risk it all than stick around.
And I think I think if you were Theon, you would rather die at that point.
Sure.
And if you were Sansa, you would rather die at that point. And I think when he saw that she was maybe going to start to suffer the physical torture
Yes.
that he had suffered, that was his breaking point.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that I wish it had built a little more, like if he had started to build his courage, because Reek was so
Right.
broken that it was hard to think that he could even do that.
In that so quick,
It's so quick. Having said that, I mean, I think that there's a lot of cliffhangers in this. That one's like literally like
cliffhanger,
they
yeah.
jumped. We don't know where. I would rather jump risking death than stay with Ramsay
sure.
if I was either of them too. But I do think that, man, just part of the inherent problem again of this series is having so many characters means that some of them just aren't going to get the attention they need to really fulfill their arc.
Yeah, because I totally agree, by the way. It made sense that what was going to stir him more than anything was when she starts to specifically say, we're going to take
cut stuff off you."
Yeah, that would, having gone through that, what that would do to him. But yeah, it just felt like we needed a scene or two more before that, actually, that might lead into him being able to do
Hard for me to
that.
understand how anybody could withstand that torture and survive and not go into shock in that world. It's not like they have like crazy good doctors. All right, we have to wrap up. We didn't really talk about many of the book sort of aspects of this book.
Yeah.
Of this one thing I do want to say, we're going to talk about a book spoiler very quickly here. So Game of Thrones book spoiler ahead. Ready?
You still with us?
If Jon is resurrected, A, will he consider himself a member of the Night's Watch and be the Jon we know, or does he become Lady Stoneheart? And George R. R. Martin has said that the reason that he wrote Stoneheart is to illustrate the idea that death changes you.
I think he might. Yeah, I think that seems kind of reasonable, because even with Beric, there was the talk when we saw Beric. I remember it was just a reminder, flaming sword guy, because
Yeah.
again, it's been several years.
Yeah.
With Beric, there was that idea, and this is a traditional idea of like you come back to life, but there's something wrong with you. There's something off. There is
It's
still
a very common horror
yeah.
trope.
You are paying a price.
Pet Cemetery.
Yeah. And so Lady Stoneheart is so direct. I mean, she is not herself. She's a ghastly ghoul.
She's a vengeance demon.
Right.
Cool one.
And I do think Jon maybe, and again, because there's been such sort of surprise that they've never included Lady Stoneheart on the show, but maybe in the purpose of streamlining, maybe they're like, let's just sort of give that to Jon, who again, I do think will be back in the books one way or the other.
Right.
But in the show, I think it's aiming towards Melisandre resurrecting him and something being off, or the price that it has to pay.
The price of him coming back to life. I mean, here's the other thing is that they've never set this up in the show, but in the book, he's a warg.
Right.
He can go into ghost. He can have a second life that way, what they call the second life.
Right, and a lot of people think that when he's dying in the book, which in the book is a little more ambiguous. The show depicts his moment of death, it seems, much more than where we left off in the book, where it was a little bit of room there, but a lot of people thought that little bit of room was simply as he's dying, he's going to put himself into ghost, and that's how he's going to save himself. Yeah.
I doubt that now because the show they haven't set it up.
The show would be so out of nowhere for that to happen.
Yeah, Joshua's like, the show is the way of sifting through the things that matter and don't matter in the book. So I think probably in the books and the show, Melisandre will be bringing back. Or they might just totally go separate ways. We're going to talk about that much more depth next week when we do our big season wrap up, and we'll include some predictions that are sort of based on the book and also based on the show, because we're caught up now. We're all on the same page, guys. We all know nothing together, Jon Snow.
Yes.
Oh, Jon Snow. Let us know what you thought of the episode in the comments below. Email us, or not email us, I guess tweet us at The Eric Goldman. It's now The Eric Goldman. And I am at Roth Cornett. Thanks so much, and for all things Game of Thrones, keep it right here on IGN.